The Forgotten Ones, a real horror story from the hills of Montana, was the summer of 1998 when Aaron Lewis, a 28-year-old wildlife researcher, first arrived in the isolated town of Belle Hollow, nestled deep in the hills of western Montana. The town was beautiful in an unsettling way. Pine trees cloaked the winding roads like guardians keeping secrets, and the wind carried with it more than just the scent of wet bark and old earth. It was a place where time seemed to hesitate, hovering just long enough to notice that things were off. Aaron had come on a federal grant to study wolf migration patterns, and Bell Hollow's untouched forests offered a goldmine of information. The townspeople were friendly enough at first, if a little guarded. They spoke with strange phrases and avoided certain roads. There was one route in particular, Old Briar Trail, that everyone warned him about. The postman, the diner waitress, even the sheriff. They all said the same thing: don't go past the burnt tree. Of course, Aaron didn't listen. 1 week into his research, after failing to locate any viable wolf tracks, he decided to go deeper into the forest. His maps showed that Old Briar Trail led to a clearing that might offer better data. Ignoring the town's warnings, he packed his gear, locked up his cabin, and hiked out early the next morning. The deeper he walked into the woods, the more silent everything became. Not the kind of peaceful silence that you find in nature, but a suffocating one. No birds, no rustling. Even the wind held its breath. About an hour in, he found the burnt tree. Charred black, twisted unnaturally, it stood like a skeleton arm reaching toward the gray sky. He hesitated, the warnings of the townspeople echoing in his mind. But curiosity won, as it often does in horror stories that are unfortunately real. What Aaron didn't know was that beyond that tree wasn't just forest. It was where the earth remembered. He reached the clearing by late afternoon. There were remnants of old buildings, just stone foundations now, and the remains of what seemed like a fire pit. Strangely, the vegetation around it was dead. No moss, no weeds. The air felt heavier. His watch stopped working. His GPS flickered. He set up his camera to begin observation, but something caught his eye. A movement, too swift and too smooth, darting behind one of the ruins. He called out, thinking maybe another hiker had gotten lost. But no one answered. That night, he camped in the clearing. That was his second mistake. Around midnight, the air turned cold, biting through his thermal gear like knives of ice. The fire he built barely stayed lit, and when it did, the flames turned blue at the edges. Then came the sounds. Whispers, but they weren't in English. It was a broken, guttural language, repeating the same sequence over and over again. He turned his flashlight on and saw the trees swaying violently though the air was still. Something passed by his tent. Something big. He stepped out, heart pounding, and scanned the tree line. And that's when he saw them. At first, just eyes. Dozens of glowing, pale orbs floating at varying heights. Then the outlines formed, humanoid but stretched, their limbs too long, faces sunken like dried leather. Their mouths didn't move, but the whispers grew louder. Aaron ran. He didn't even pack. He just ran, stumbling through underbrush, slicing his arms on thorns. The woods seemed endless now, twisting, repeating. No matter which direction he went, he found himself back at the burnt tree. He collapsed there from exhaustion as dawn crept in. The creatures had vanished, replaced by eerie quiet. And then he noticed the symbols, carved into the base of the tree. Dozens of them. Names. Hundreds of names. One of them was his. Aaron made it back to Belle Hollow that evening, shaken and bleeding. The sheriff found him and said nothing, just helped him into his truck and drove him to the local clinic. No questions. No surprise. Just silence that he stayed in town another 2 days. Nobody asked him what happened, but he noticed the looks, the pity, the fear, and the relief, as if some curse had shifted from them to him. Before he left, an old woman approached him at the gas station. She handed him a small box wrapped in leather. "Don't open it," she said. "Not here. Not anywhere near trees." He asked what it was. She only replied, "A memory. Not all memories are yours to carry." He left Belle Hollow and never returned. But the story doesn't end there. Over the years, Aaron tried to forget. He moved across the country, changed professions, found solace in routine. But the whispers never stopped. At night, just before sleep, he'd hear them. That broken language, faint but insistent. He would wake up with dirt on his hands, pine needles in his sheets. Sometimes he'd find strange symbols etched into his walls, always the same ones he saw on that tree point 2 years ago. A couple disappeared while camping in Belle Hollow. Then a search party. Then a journalist. Only Aaron knew the pattern. He began documenting the disappearances, tracking them. All had one thing in common. They went past the burnt tree he tried to warn others. No one believed him. 3 months ago, he returned to Belle Hollow. He left a letter behind. It simply said, "They are not ghosts. They are not demons. They are us, forgotten, unloved, and unremembered. And we are never truly alone in the woods." He was never seen again. The box the old woman gave him was found unopened in his apartment, still wrapped in leather. Inside were old photographs, dating back to the 1800s, faded and cracked, all of them taken in the same forest clearing, the same ruins. In the background of every image was a burnt tree, and surrounding it, figures, dozens of them, blurred, stretched, not quite human. The last photo had one more thing. In the corner, just barely visible, was Aaron, smiling, but his eyes were no longer his. And somewhere deep in the hills of Montana, near a burnt tree, the forest still remembers, and it is still adding names. The Forgotten Ones, Part 2. Returned to Belle Hollow. It had been 12 years since Aaron Lewis vanished. Officially, he was listed as missing, presumed dead, but within the academic community, his name still came up, always in hushed tones. Some called him brilliant, others called him unstable, but one person called him something else entirely: Uncle. Clara Lewis was a 26-year-old investigative podcaster known for exposing backwoods myths and urban legends. Her podcast, Beyond the Pines, had a cult following, and Aaron's story was the one she never dared to cover. Until now, she had grown up hearing fragments of his tale, muted conversations between her parents, an unopened package labeled Aaron, evidence, and a worn leather box she was never allowed to touch. But when Clara's own father passed away unexpectedly, she discovered something hidden in a crawl space in the garage: a set of recordings. They were labeled in faded ink, Belle Hollow. Day 1, Day 5. The voice on them was unmistakable, Aaron's, calm but increasingly frayed as the days passed. He spoke of wolf tracks that turned to footprints, of stone foundations where no maps marked anything, of whispers, and then silence. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She packed her gear and drove across the country, determined to find Belle Hollow and finish what Aaron had started. When Clara arrived, the town was even more isolated than she imagined. No Wi-Fi, a population that hadn't grown in a decade, and a chilling air of resistance. The locals still remembered Aaron, but none would say his name aloud at the gas station. An elderly woman stared at her too long. Finally, she approached and said something that made Clara's blood go cold. "You have his eyes and his debt." That night, Clara checked into the same cabin Aaron had used. Everything looked preserved, untouched by time. On the mantel was a photo of Aaron, staring off into the woods behind the cabin. There were symbols drawn faintly into the wood above the fireplace. Runes, matching the ones she'd seen in his notes. She recorded everything. Her first podcast episode on Belle Hollow aired that night, and within 24 hours it exploded in popularity. Thousands listened, but none knew that Clara never posted the second episode, because the next morning, Clara went into the forest. She followed Aaron's trail right up to the burnt tree. It still stood, blackened, twisted, reeking faintly of ash even after more than a decade. Against all logic, she stepped past it. The forest changed immediately. The sky dimmed though it was midday. The air thickened. The GPS blinked out. Her phone turned to static. And then came the smells: charcoal, rot, and something else, like wet, decaying meat. She found the same ruins Aaron described, but now overgrown with thorns and mold. The fire pit was still there, cold and empty. But Clara saw fresh footprints, and then movement, not in front of her, but behind. She turned, only to catch the tail end of something slipping behind a tree. Long limbs, black skin, no sound. Her breath hitched. Still, she pressed record. "This is Clara Lewis. Day 1. I'm here at the ruins where my uncle vanished. The symbols he wrote, they're here. And I swear, I'm not alone. Something's watching me, listening." The wind picked up. The trees began to sway, even as the leaves stayed still. Clara heard it then. The same guttural whispers Aaron described, looping endlessly in a language not meant for human throats. She ran. But like Aaron, she found herself caught in a maze. No matter which direction she went, she ended up back at the burnt tree. Hours passed. Night came early. That's when they showed themselves, dozens of them. Pale eyes, stretching shadows, elongated fingers twitching in unnatural rhythm. They didn't approach. Not yet. They watched. And then Clara understood something Aaron never had the chance to say. "They want you to speak." She turned her microphone on. "My name is Clara Lewis. If you're hearing this, I need you to know these are not ghosts. They are echoes, trapped by memory, held by belief, each of them forgotten by someone who never said their name again, each of them clinging to the living, hoping to be remembered. But when you remember them, they take your place." She paused, and the whispers stopped. They were closer now. She dropped her recorder and ran. But the path didn't change. No matter how far she sprinted, the tree waited for her. And now, her name was there, scratched freshly into the bark. Clara Lewis. Her voice was the last thing ever recorded. I understand now. The forgotten ones, they are memory itself. They are what happens when you bury something too deep. They are patient. The next morning, the sheriff found her recorder outside the gas station. It was placed neatly on the steps, wrapped in leathered NO sign of Clara, NO footprints, NOCA, or NO podcast uploads ever again. A new listener who stumbled across Beyond the Pines 6 weeks later found only one episode available, Belle Hollow, Part 1. The cover art had changed. It now showed a tree on fire, with two figures standing behind it, barely visible in the static point. One looked like Aaron. The other was Clara, and the description simply read, "Some forests remember. Others never forget." The podcast was removed from all platforms a week later, but the names are still growing. So when you hear a voice whispering your name late at night, don't answer, because if you remember them, they remember you too. The Forgotten Ones, Part 3. The Whisper line. 9 months had passed since Clara Lewis vanished in Belle Hollow. Her podcast feed remained frozen, and though her recordings went viral for a brief time, drawing attention from amateur investigators, conspiracy theorists, and paranormal hunters, it eventually faded from the public eye. Most dismissed it as a hoax, a well-crafted story, a marketing stunt, but not everyone forgot. Point one of Clara's devoted listeners, Mason Trent, wasn't just another fan. He was a former crime scene technician who had quit after something he couldn't explain during an investigation in Arizona. A girl found alive in a sealed basement, surrounded by ancient symbols carved into her skin. Symbols that matched those Clara mentioned in her final recording. He'd been chasing those markings for years, but Clara's podcast was the first time he heard someone describe them so vividly, so accurately, and so terrified he made it his mission to find her. It was winter when Mason arrived in Belle Hollow. Snow covered the roads like white silence, and the trees stood naked and patient. Unlike Clara, Mason didn't announce his arrival. He came quietly, blending in. He booked a room at the old roadside inn, brought equipment, notebooks, maps, and a leather-bound copy of Clara's transcriptions. Locals still refused to speak, but they noticed him. They always noticed the ones who stayed too long. The third night, something strange happened. He was reviewing Clara's last audio file in his room, volume muted, but the waveform began to shift. Peaks began to move on their own. The audio editor displayed flickers of white noise, and a new frequency emerged, ultrasonic, barely perceptible. And then the waveform formed a shape. A tree. Mason leaned back, trying not to believe what he was seeing. He captured it, ran diagnostics, and isolated the signal. It repeated every 13 seconds, layered under Clara's final words. Beneath the voice was a whisper loop. He boosted the frequency and played it back. It was a name, not Clara. Not Aaron. It was his. That night, Mason dreamt of a clearing. Cold wind, eyes blinking through the mist. A girl, no older than 12, standing alone at the base of a blackened tree. She turned to him and said, "They're forgetting me." He woke with a gasp, sweat soaking the bed. On the mirror across the room, drawn in frost, were 5 words. You heard them. They know. He decided then he would go to the tree. He had to, but he would go prepared. He outfitted himself with thermal gear, EMF scanners, analog recording devices, and a mechanical compass. Nothing digital. He knew now that Belle Hollow twisted technology like a predator plays with prey. At dawn, he set out, following the old maps, matching Clara's coordinates. He reached the burnt tree by noon. It was taller than he expected, nearly 30 feet, black as coal, the bark still flaking warm ash. The clearing beyond was dead silent. He knelt and placed a microphone on the earth. Instantly, the ground hummed. He spoke into it. "My name is Mason Trent. I remember Clara Lewis. I remember Aaron Lewis. I remember every name they buried here." The wind howled once, then stopped. The air thinned, and then came the voices, not whispers, wails. Thousands overlapping, screaming and pleading. Some cried, some laughed. One simply repeated Mason's name over and over until it was no longer his name but something else. Stretched and broken, Mason's compass spun wildly. The EMF spiked. Then, all devices shut down, and from the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped forward. Clara, but she wasn't right. Her eyes were blank, her clothes torn and covered in frostbite scars. She opened her mouth, and the same voice as Aaron's came out. "You can't remember us," and leave. Mason froze. He backed up toward the tree, but now dozens of figures were emerging from the woods. All identical in shape, too tall, faces smooth like wax, eyes white and hollow. They circled him slowly, like dancers in a nightmare ritual. And then, they stopped point one by one. They began to speak, not to Mason, but through him, his voice hijacked by each soul trapped in that clearing. "My name was Eliza Bright. I died in 1927. No one said my name again. My name was Jonah Redfield. They buried me under the schoolhouse. I was never found. My name was Clara Lewis." He dropped to his knees as every voice screamed through him. Blood ran from his nose. His body shook. The ground cracked beneath him. And then, silenced, he woke in the cabin 2 days later. He remembered none of it. Only that his name was now on the tree. That he returned to the city. Quit his job. Disappeared from online spaces. But every night since, he's recorded himself sleep-talking in dozens of voices, all giving names, all begging to be remembered. One of his last recordings has now surfaced online. How? No one knows. In it, he whispers, they don't want to be freed. They want you to remember them just long enough for them to trade places. His apartment was found abandoned, but inside, investigators found a list of 1,103 names. The walls were covered in a single phrase, over and over. To remember is to be marked. Authorities deemed it a hoax. Another ghost chaser gone mad. But something strange has started happening across the country. People who listened to Clara's podcast, people who downloaded Mason's file, they're disappearing. And in their homes, investigators find tree carvings. On mirrors, on wallpaper, on human skin, names no one remembers. The whisper line is spreading. You don't need to go to Belle Hollow anymore. It's already come to you. So ask yourself, who have you forgotten? And more importantly, who still remembers you? The Forgotten Ones, Part 4. The memory that binds. There was a time when Belle Hollow was just a name whispered on obscure forums and lost podcast episodes. Now it's an infection. It began subtly. A nurse in Chicago reported a patient whispering names in his sleep, names that matched people never born. A librarian in Virginia found a book that wasn't part of their system. It had no title, only a black tree drawn on the cover and 600 pages of handwritten names. Names that vanished when touched. And in Portland, a teenage girl live-streamed herself whispering into a static-filled mic. They don't need the tree anymore. They've learned to grow in us. The video was deleted 5 minutes later, but not before it was downloaded thousands of times. The curse was no longer tethered to Belle Hollow. The Forgotten Ones had learned something new, something monstrous. They had found a way to be remembered through technology. Enter the next witness, Dr. Jordan Blythe, a professor of folklore and digital mythology at a New England university. Dr. Blythe dismissed Clara Lewis' podcast as viral fiction. But when one of his students, an introvert named Marissa Keel, went missing after submitting a thesis on the Whisper Network, he began to pay attention. Marissa had written that memory could be carried not just by people, but by systems. She had uploaded something called the archive tree, a hidden page online. Anyone who visited it was greeted by a black screen and one word: name. If you typed your name, nothing happened, but a week later, you'd begin to forget things. First small things: keys, faces, birthdays. Then deeper things: your voice, your own handwriting, the memory of your childhood, and finally, your name. Those who interacted with the archive tree became the next generation of forgotten ones. Dr. Bly accessed the site on a VPN. He typed Aaron Lewis. Nothing happened at first, but then his office light flickered, and then the whispers started, faint and wet, like breath behind glass. That he checked his computer. The screen was blank, yet the speakers played a rhythmic click. Morse code. He translated it spelled. You opened the root. Over the next 48 hours, Dr. Bly documented everything. Objects moved. Voices spoke in languages he couldn't identify. Every mirror reflected him standing slightly off-center, as if something stood behind him. Then, in the early hours of a cold morning, he got a package. There was no return address. Inside were Polaroid photographs. Dozens. All showed black and white images of the Belle Hollow forest, but with modern buildings in the background. An apartment tower, a Walmart, a school. The forest, it seemed, was spreading under cities. A map was included. But instead of roads and towns, it marked the roots of the forgotten ones. Locations where people had disappeared and where digital signals began behaving abnormally. Point 1 mark pulsed in red. Dr. Bly's campus. He tried to leave town, but his car refused to start. His phone GPS kept rerouting him to a location just outside campus, a shuttered auditorium built in the 1950s, a building no student ever used. It was rumored to be cursed. Now, it had its purpose. He entered it just before dusk. Inside, the seats had all been removed. The stage was covered in dirt, pine needles, and ash. And at the center, growing through the floorboards, was a tree, black, twisted, burning without smoke. The air was filled with names. Whispers. Some sounded like Clara, some like children. One sounded like himself, crying from a place far away. That he began to understand. Belle Hollow was never a town. It was a doorway. And now, the doorway was everywhere. Something moved in the rafters. He looked up. The ceiling opened like lungs, and from the shadows, long-limbed figures began to descend, silent, dripping a black fluid that hissed against the wood. Their eyes glowed dimly, like embers in deep fog, and then one of them stepped into him. Not an attack, a merging. He fell to the ground and screamed. When he woke hours later, he was in his office. Clean, unharmed, no tree, no dirt, but the voice in his head remained. It whispered, always, you are no longer the rememberer. He opened his laptop. All his files were gone, except one new folder labeled You. Inside, video footage. Grainy, but unmistakable. It showed him walking into the auditorium. It showed him standing still. It showed the creatures forming from his body like mist-made flesh. It ended with a close-up of his face. His eyes weren't human anymore. Now Dr. Jordan Bly's name is on the tree. There are no forests near his university, but students say When you walk past the auditorium at night, you can hear scratching, not on the walls, inside your mind, and sometimes you'll feel like you've forgotten something crucial, like your roommate's name or your sister's birthday. But it's not you who forgot, it's them who were taken. The whisper line grows wider now. The names are seeded into podcasts, into blog comments, into file names you accidentally click. They don't just want to be remembered, they want to overwrite you. You don't find Belle Hollow anymore. It finds you. So if you hear your name whispered in static, if your dreams are filled with trees on fire and voices crying out from beneath the soil, don't speak back. Don't write it down. Don't try to help them. Because if you do, you'll become just another name in the forgotten ones. The Forgotten Ones, Part 5. The archivist Dorian Vale never believed in ghosts, that he built a career on skepticism, exposing false psychics, unraveling conspiracy theories, and debunking viral internet horror. His YouTube channel Behind the Curtain had over 4 million subscribers, and his motto was simple: truth over fear. Then, he got an email. It was anonymous. No subject, just a link to a folder titled Clara Lewis __ sequence _ Bloom. Inside were dozens of .wav files, some only seconds long. Others were corrupted, but all had something in common: distorted whispers in frequencies just above human hearing, and every one of them mentioned his name. Dorian assumed it was a prank. He mentioned it in his next video with a smirk, mocking the ominous tone of the files and promising to hunt the source and embarrass whoever's behind this whisper ghost nonsense. That video would be his last point. 3 days after uploading it, the real messages began, not in email, but in audio glitches during his live streams, strange voices layered under his own. Not heard live, only in the replays. Viewers began posting timestamps. 2:11. Who's the woman whispering? 5:03. There's a second Dorian voice. It says they're watching. 10:22. His eyes change. He watched the footage himself, frame by frame. And it was true. His reflection in the screen blinked when he didn't. A second voice echoed him perfectly, then changed the words. And behind him, shadows stretched too far. He stopped filming after that he stayed inside. But the voices followed. The walls in his apartment began to weep black sap. His bookshelf rearranged itself into names. His camera turned on by itself at night and recorded 6 hours of silence. Except it wasn't silence. When the audio was inverted and slowed, it revealed a message: you've been chosen. Not to speak, to remember, to pass the route forward. That same night, someone knocked on his door. Not a visitor, a delivery, a package. No return label, sealed with wax in the shape of a twisted tree. Inside was a cassette tape. No brand, no labels, just a symbol scorched into the plastic. An eye inside the branches. He bought a player and listened to it in a hotel room 2 cities away. Static. Then a single voice. Not Clara. Not Aaron. Not Mason or Dr. Bly. This was a child's voice. I remember my name now. You helped. Thank you. But now I go back, and you stay. Then screaming. Hundreds of voices. Then a final line. You are the archivist now. That's when the fire started. Not physical, but in his memory. Whole sections of his life began to vanish. The name of his high school. His first girlfriend. His father's voice. Gone. Replaced by new things. An old farmhouse with a tree growing through the living room. A mirror that speaks only in backwards time. at a field full of standing stones whispering names at dusk. He wasn't remembering someone else's memories, he was hosting them. The Forgotten Ones had found their next vessel, and they needed him to deliver it. He fled, changed his name, deleted his channel, but it was too late. Whispers followed him on trains, in airports, in sleep. They called him archivist. He stopped hearing his own voice in recordings, only theirs. Then came the final stage. The seed manifestation.it started in his teeth. They loosened and fell, not bloody, but blackened, like wood burned hollow. When he went to the dentist, they found roots in his gums. Tiny, living roots, stretching down into his jaw. Then he stopped speaking entirely, because every time he opened his mouth, a different voice came out. That he wandered into the woods in Oregon, last seen 3 weeks ago by hikers. He said just 5 words before stepping into the tree line. Do not remember my name. His abandoned apartment was found with every surface carved in perfect handwriting, over and over again. The archivist lives in sound. And one final message burned into the carpet. If you hear this story, you are already part of it. The video of his final live stream was leaked. Experts confirmed. The waveform contained over 1,900 unique vocal patterns, more than could exist in a human lifetime. But among them was yours. It spoke your name. Only once. Backwards. A whisper. A warning. A root. Because the Forgotten Ones don't haunt graveyards. They haunt memory. And now they have a voice. Yours. The Forgotten Ones. Part 6. Remember nothing. They call her the one who resisted. Elia Moore was a neurolinguistic programmer, a language analyst working for a dark data agency, a government-adjacent contractor that monitored patterns in global speech, dialect evolution, and coded signals hidden in social chatter. Her job was to detect words that didn't belong. Sounds that traveled in clusters but never originated from anywhere. She found one. A phonetic pattern that didn't match any human dialect. Not synthetic, not AI generated, not ancient. It was alien in construction but human in memory. It echoed across voice recordings, dead phone lines, corrupted voicemails, emergency broadcasts. She called it Whisper Root. She didn't know she had spoken it out loud until blood leaked from her ears. The sound wasn't meant to be repeated. That night, her apartment shook, but only in mirrors. Her reflection began moving half a second behind her real self. Then, a second ahead. Then, something else entirely. She tried to sleep. She dreamed of a world made of forests that moved like tides, of cities buried under trees, of names falling from the sky like ash. And then she saw them. The Forgotten Ones. They don't walk. They grow. They spiral out of broken thoughts, from the memory of forgotten trauma, from guilt abandoned and grief unspoken. They are the roots beneath denial. She woke with dirt in her mouth. Her phone no longer displayed time. Only names, scrolling infinitely. Names she didn't know, but felt. Her own name appeared last, then faded. From that point on, no one remembered her. Not her sister, not her colleagues, not even her bank. She became a living anomaly. A woman erased from all digital and social memory, a ghost in a breathing body. But Elia wasn't like the others. She fought back. She started recording herself daily, writing her name in ink, tattooing it into her skin, screaming it aloud in the woods. But they were always listening. They want her not dead, but undone. She traveled to the last known location of Clara Lewis. She found the burnt tree, now split down the center, revealing a hollow. Inside, bones, but the bones were arranged in patterns, runic, deliberate, grammatical, language made of memory. She realized something no one else had. The forgotten ones were not spirits. They were sentences, incomplete, unfinished thoughts. People who had been interrupted in the moment of emotional collapse, frozen in heartbreak, in guilt, in pain. And the only way they could be freed was to finish the sentence. But whoever finishes it must take their place. That's why Aaron vanished, why Clara vanished, why Dorian forgot his own voice. They spoke the last word. Elliot traced the grammar tree and found hers, a broken sentence written in blood across a stone. I should have said sorry before you left. She hadn't spoken to her mother in 9 years. The fight that ended it was the last sentence her mother ever heard. Her mother died a week later. Grief carved Elia open, and the forgotten ones had found that wound. They rooted into it. She realized now. They don't hunt randomly. They feed on unfinished pain, unspoken regret, words we meant to say but didn't. They are the weight of memory itself. And now they were evolving. They no longer needed trees. They had grown digital. Every name forgotten, every voice ignored in voicemail, every deleted message was soil, and we were watering them. She tried to flee Belle Hollow. But Belle Hollow was no longer a place that it was in her. Her shadow stopped matching her. Her voice echoed in silent rooms that night. The walls whispered not her name, but her regret. She screamed, "I'm sorry." And in that moment, they smiled. They smiled through her face, because she had spoken the final word. We do not disappear. We are spoken. And when you finish our sentence, you give us your breath. Elia was found 3 days later, alive but silent, mute. No memory of who she was. Her arms covered in language, every name. She now lives in a secure facility. Every morning, she writes the same line on the wall. Don't speak the last word. But the world isn't listening. The whisper route has gone viral on TikTok.in Discord calls, through corrupted voicemail spam on white noise playlists. People repeat the sound without knowing. They finish forgotten sentences. They say things like, I shouldn't have left the door open, or I wish I had told her, or he never forgave me. And when they do, something hears them and finishes the rest. Now there's a new archive it's not online it's inside us. When you forget something tonight, your keys, your childhood friend's birthday, your first kiss, know this. That memory didn't fade it was taken. Because the forgotten ones aren't haunting us, they're becoming us. Point one memory at a time. And if you ever dream of a black tree on fire, run. Because that's the last time you'll remember your name. The unraveling. The truth buried so deep, even remembering it is a curse. Everything ends here, or begins again. The forgotten ones, final part. The root of all memory. No one knows who he is. No birth records. No ID. No fingerprints in any database. He appeared in a rural Missouri hospital, unconscious, half buried in mud, with ancient tree bark embedded in his lungs. They called him John Root. But that's not his name, because he doesn't have one anymore. Doctors said he was brain dead, but then he opened his eyes and began speaking, not to people, but through them. Every nurse that walked into his room began reciting names they didn't know, languages they never studied, One man wept uncontrollably and repeated, "I remember now for 4 hours," and then forgot everything: his job, his wife, even how to speak. John Root never moved. But the hospital changed. The building filled with sounds in the vents. Lights flickered in sequence. Security cameras recorded not patients, but forests, forests growing through the corridors, flickering in and out like memories fighting for space. That a nurse finally snapped. She tried to destroy the life support system. But when she pulled the plug, nothing happened, because there was no machine keeping him alive. Only words, whispers in the walls. That night, the hospital burned to the ground. No survivors. But the body of John Root was never found. Only a name, carved into the ash: yours. From that point, the memory plague escalated. Children forgetting their parents mid-sentence. Couples waking up as strangers. People found standing still in intersections, eyes glazed, mouths whispering lists of names. The whisper. Root had become airborne, not in breath, but in thought. Every time you remembered something painful but ignored it. Every time you felt regret and shoved it down. Every time you stopped yourself from finishing a sentence, you watered them. Meanwhile, deep beneath what used to be Belle Hollow, something was waking, buried under decades of grief and language, under every lost moment that humanity ever tried to forget. Was the origin sentence, not a person, not a spirit, not a god, but the first memory, ever denied, the first pain never spoken, the scream a child choked back as the world ended around them. That memory had formed a consciousness, and now it wanted one thing: to be spoken into full existence. To replace everything, all of us. Clara Lewis was never found. Aaron Lewis was never buried. Dorian's voice still floats through corrupted static, and Elia Moore is now called the Unwriter. She sits in a hidden facility beneath 7 layers of concrete. She does not eat. She does not sleep. She does not speak, because if she does, the world ends. She holds the final word on her tongue, the last word of the origin sentence. She's forgotten everything, except that she must never say it. But something's been trying to make her speak. Memories appear to her that aren't hers. She feels loves she never lived, losses she never knew. She dreams of a tree with 1,000 mouths, each one whispering, "We were you before you remembered being you." The containment is cracking because someone, maybe you, has said something they shouldn't. That you've spoken a name in the dark. That you've finished someone else's thought. That you've whispered regret to no one. And that regret was heard. The origin sentence is almost complete. That it goes like this: once I was, and the last word is missing. That word will reshape the world, not destroy it, override it. You won't know it happened, because all memory will rewrite, and you'll believe things were always this way. You'll think Belle Hollow was just a dream, that forests don't whisper, that you always had that scar on your arm shaped like a tree branch, that your mother always said, "Don't go near the old woods." And your name? You'll forget it, because it's not yours anymore. You gave it away when you remembered someone who shouldn't exist, and now you're one of the forgotten ones. There are no endings, only unfinished sentences. And if you're hearing this, if the lights flicker as you read, if you feel a memory surfacing that you don't remember living, then it's too late, because you've become the final narrator. You will carry the root. You will finish the sentence, and the next time someone forgets your name, you'll whisper it back from the trees. Once I was, The screen cuts to black. A voice, no longer human, says, "Now remember me." Then silence. And if you listen long enough, your name will vanish. You've reached the end of the forgotten ones. But remember, this was never just a story. These names, these forests, these memories, they didn't vanish. They were simply waiting for someone to remember. If you feel something watching you now, if something inside you stirs at the name Belle Hollow, you've already been chosen. Subscribe if you haven't already, and whatever you do, don't say your name out loud. Not tonight. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real incident-based horror stories. Know someone who loves terrifying mysteries? Share this with them. Drop a comment if this reminded you of a place or memory you can't quite explain. Because some stories feel too real to be fiction.